Well, let's get this rolling. Again, if I haven't introduced myself yet, my name is Michelle. I'm part of the Tribal Hub team. Thank you for being here today for our webinar with Arctic IT, which is focusing on zero trust, implementing a zero trust architecture for your tribe. Presenters today are Bill Travitz and Brent Nix. Many of you probably know Bill. He, before working with Arctic IT, he was served on our Tribal ISAC board. He was the director of IT for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Brent, who is accompanying him today, is a senior technical specialist with Microsoft and works directly with tribes with zero trust. This session is being recorded, and within 24 hours, you'll get a copy of the recording if you want to share it with anybody on your team. A couple learning objectives to take away from the webinar. Also, make sure you use that chat or the Q&A feature to put in any questions that you have, and we will either take those at the end or during the session, so make sure you get those in. A couple of upcoming webinars we have. If you'd like to join in on those, just go to tribalhub.com and you can register that way. And what's new with us here at Tribal Hub, we will be announcing where our 2023 TribalNet conference will be in November. I'm hoping it's someplace nice and warm, but we'll see. And yeah, Tribal ISAC, which is supported by Tribal Hub, is a Cybersecurity Awareness Month champion. If you'd like information about that, you can head over to their LinkedIn page and see all kinds of good stuff there. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'll turn it over to you, Bill, to drive this webinar.
All right, thank you very much. All right,
Yeah,
bear with me, everybody. I'm going to make the attempt to get this screen shared out. All right. All right, can you see it?
I can.
Yep, it looks good.
Awesome. Great. Well, hey, thank you everybody for coming and attending the webinar today. It's a great privilege to be here. I love the Tribal Hub organization, and just being able to share here with TribalWise is a real honor for me. We're going to be covering today implementing zero trust architecture for tribes. And I'll get into the agenda here in just a second. But one of the things that we wanted to focus on in today's webinar was looking at it from the perspective that Microsoft has a lot of marketing collateral telling you what it is and how you might implement it theoretically. But what we're going to try to focus on here today is how does it happen in the real world? Like, what are the tangible steps that you can take? Where do you focus? Those sorts of things. So we'll get into that as we get into the webinar. So here's our presentation for today, just the agenda. We're going to gloss over the partnership thing really quick, talk a little bit about what zero trust is at a high level, and how do you implement it. And that's where we're going to really get into the tangible steps of how to break it down and make it make it digestible. I should say that during my time with the Eastern Band, we, as many of you know, we were ransomed and were basically put completely out of business. So we had a unique situation there where we were able to build from the ground up into a full cloud implementation of zero trust. So much of what I'm going to talk about today comes from that experience. But I would also like to let everybody know that that process is still ongoing. I was there for almost 3 years and we were still working on it. So it's not something that happens overnight. Even if you have to start from the ground up and really have no assets that are up and running. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I am going to talk a little bit about the journey of the Eastern Band, and then a little bit about how do you get started with this thing. So, and Brent is graciously consented to be here to really go through the details of zero trust. And there's a lot of material in these slides, folks. So we're not going to read them all to you. The deck will obviously be available through TribalWise, and you'll be able to use it and use the detail that's in there. So without further ado, just a little bit about the partnership. Arctic IT, as many of you know, is owned by Doyon Limited. We have 15 years or more actually of community engagement with the tribal community. So just wanted to touch base on that a little bit. We are here to build partnerships and to share information. When my leadership has been very gracious with my time since I've started with Arctic back at the end of June, in allowing me to really interact with tribes and share the wealth on the journey that I had to, I experienced, and really allowing me to partner with you to provide that information. So I won't go on anymore. There's a almost up-to-date list of places where we have tribal clients. And without any more talk about that, we'll go right over to defining a zero trust architecture. And I'm going to hang on to the presentation mode here for just a few minutes. And then we're going to turn it over to Brent, where he's really going to put the flesh on the bones. So never trust, always verify, least privileged access, just-in-time elevation, which is not on there, and the principle of assumed breach. You have to decide right here and now that somebody's already inside your network. We've always taken the castle with the moat approach with very high walls, but once somebody breaches that in the traditional security context, once they're inside the castle, they get to move around freely from point A to B. And that was the experience that I had, my team had with the Eastern Band. So those are some of the highlights there. So this particular slide is interesting. It really just reiterates some of what I said there. You can read that all for yourself, but you're switching your mindset to an identity-centric world. Traditional security architectures under Active Directory were very device-centric in terms of the way they implemented security. Of course, there was identity verification, but when you switch to the zero trust idea, you're making a north-south relationship with Azure Active Directory and not with a local copy of Active Directory, which means then that nobody trusts each other east-west on the network, which is an important point that we'll get to here in just a little while. So along the bottom there is the pillars. So let me back up. We're talking here about zero trust in the Azure Microsoft 365 world. Every zero trust is a known concept. The federal government has publications on it. It can be implemented over Amazon, over Azure. Our experience, we're a Microsoft Gold partner. So we're going to talk about it from the Azure perspective, and I'm sure that's why most of you are here. But let's go ahead. The bottom of that model really talks about the pillars of zero trust, and Brent is going to go into some detail about how that gets executed across each of those areas. So let's go ahead, and Brent, I'm going to turn it over to you and bring up my favorite slide.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the intro into zero trust. Again, I think so. Microsoft has 7 pillars of zero trust. I think somebody else has 6, somebody else has 8. The point isn't getting too hyper focused on the pillars, because when you break them down, they're all the same thing. And I think the zero trust conversation is continuing to mature. Because there's no such thing as zero trusted. This is something that every organization has to take a journey on. And so my hope is, with discussing through these individual topics, we can talk about how a small organization, or not necessarily just small, but how organizations of all size can approach zero trust in a way that's not just trying to boil the ocean. So right in front of us right now, we've got, I'd say, a little bit of an eye chart. But the way I think it's easiest to break this down is by those 7 pillars that we had on the last slide. So we've got our identity, that is kind of, like Bill said, the mainstay of what we're going after. Our devices, or endpoints, as it was listed on the last slide, is going to be the next critical piece there. And then down the right, once we have those 2 things in place, we can start going after what makes the most sense for our organization. So whether that's data, applications, infrastructure, network, I think every organization is going to have different needs. But those main areas give us a real strategy to start getting into a zero trust architecture. Because at the end of the day, what zero trust means, and Bill mentioned this, is that we're not just trusting somebody because they're in the room, right? Like, we need to check everybody's badge every time. And that's kind of the point of focusing on identity. So whether that is in our data, in our applications, in our infrastructure, in our network, there's no broadly trusting people or identities just because they're inside the firewall. We've got some really great animations, by the way. Our Dick IT did some good job on the slides. So, like I said, the biggest and most foremost thing out of all of these is identities. And when it's a zero trust model, identities aren't just going to be people; they're also services or IoT devices. Basically, anything that has an identity and interacts with our data, our networks. We're going to be focusing on securing all of those. So when it comes to how we get after that, in a big way, we have to figure out what all of our identities are, right? So we have to be honest with ourselves as we're assessing, because we're not just assessing people. We're looking through, and we'll get to this later. We're looking through all our applications, all our devices, every entity that we have in our environments. And we're securing all those identities. One of the quickest ways to get identities under control is by using single sign-on and an MFA, multi-factor authentication. That's going to be, I'd say, for the grand majority of our customers who are walking into securing their organization in a zero trust way, they're going after that first. About a year and a couple of months ago, I was at a small DoD contractor up in the middle of the North Woods of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and we could not hire in the people to fix our problems that we had in our network. We didn't really have a shop. So similar to what a lot of tribes experience in terms of being far away and not being able to have a lot of resources that you would have in a larger city in terms of hiring pool and other things like that. And this was our first step. We made the transition over to MFA and securing our identities, and not just relying on a local identity store. I don't want to stay too long on each slide because we don't have enough time, so I'll move to the next one. But there's a lot there. With moving on to our endpoints, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to want to make sure that we know what all of our endpoints are. So that includes all of the devices that people are checking their mail on. And as we're building out these policies, we can build out conditional access so that people can't just access data because they have a login, but because the endpoint that they're coming from is protected. So we can either use MDM or MAM, MAM. MDM is device management, and MAM is application management. And we're going to be locking down those endpoints in order to make sure that they're not compromised. We're trying to make sure that people aren't coming in with compromised devices. So like it says on the bottom right, the products that Microsoft supplies in this space that meet this solution are Microsoft Endpoint Manager, Intune. I don't know if we put that up there, but Intune is a big part of that. SCCM. I mean, I think most people on the call are familiar with some sort of endpoint management tool you need to have all your endpoints managed, and then have Defender for Endpoint. So the XDR solution, being able not just to do antivirus, but also respond to threats actively in your environment. So data becomes a real concern for a lot of folks, especially with data sovereignty and archival issues. We do not want these things getting encrypted by hackers and hijacked essentially and sold back to us. So one of the biggest things that we can do is limit access to that data using conditional access policies. There are a number of ways to roll out conditional access. So it's not just based on a user and a group. but you can actually have it be based on either the context with which they're logging in. So has this person filled out the NDA that allows them access to the SharePoint page? And you can have that level of granularity. They haven't gone through that process yet. Well, sorry, they can't access that data. All the way to we don't trust the session that they're coming from based off of security analytics. So there's a good amount of machine learning that goes into securing conditional access and having it be a dynamic process, not just static-based rules. Because anybody who's spent a lot of time in a network shop is going to know that, sure, you can make a really great web of static rules, but the moment the adversary changes their tactics, everything you built is not going to be effective against that one thing. And that's where these dynamic rules really come into play, where you can say, well, you know what, Bill is logging in on a weekend from Japan. That seems not very like his normal login patterns. We're going to make him do a couple extra steps to log in, or we're not going to let him log in. You can create the web, if you will, in order to make sure that data is safe. And the last part to this before we move on is the data categorization is a big hurdle for a lot of organizations. It's non-trivial, I think, for anybody that I've talked to. We have tools that are built in. There are 90 out-of-the-box definitions, and there are probably more at this point, but the last time I checked, 90 out-of-the-box definitions for sensitive information that you can use to detect, credit card and PII and health-related information. But if you need something more granular beyond that, you can create your own custom rules that will go through and search. And also, you can set up responses within your organization so that if you incorrectly classify something and somebody puts in a part code and it comes up as PII into the chat and they get their hand slapped for it, they can say, no, that was a part code. And there can be an automated process to make sure that people can still work, because that's a big concern for everybody. Is we don't want to limit what's actually happening on our day-to-day operations that's legitimate. So on to our next slide. Applications is going to be a really big one for a lot of folks, especially because we have shadow IT. So anybody who's ever been in IT knows that all of your users will only use the applications that you give them, right? No. I feel like most of my users have always shown me where holes in our application security have been, because they'll be like, oh, no. I couldn't get our application to upload my photos, so I went through Box, or I went through this. Is that okay? And I'll be like, well, you were able to do it, so let me lock it down. And this allows you to do that. So with Defender for Cloud Apps, we can control what our users are uploading to, what our users are downloading from. If they're coming from a endpoint that is managed or the applications are managed on there, we can stop them from interacting with those applications if we don't want them to. And we can also maintain our encryption throughout other applications. We've got hooks to work with just about any other application that exists. So there's a whole catalog of turnkey solutions, and then you can also build out custom interactions if you need them. So one other thing that is really helpful for a lot of organizations that I think you can't get as a small organization, even like a medium-sized organization, you're not able to invest in the amount of machine learning that's behind all this. So we're able to use conditional access and the user entity behavioral analytics, the UEBA, machine learning, to detect malicious actions before they're able to complete their attacks. And that's overlaid over this as well. So at the E5 level, you're going to see a lot of the automation and machine learning coming in and being able to affect your operations so that you're not having to do everything manually. So I guess that's like the one thing I wanted to touch on there. And then next is infrastructure. This slide is, and I tried to update it a little bit and I missed a couple things, it looks like. I updated on the right, we have Defender for Cloud. And the reason why we switched names to Defender for Cloud and not just Azure is because we don't just protect Azure. We protect all cloud environments. So if you have assets in Google, if you have assets in Amazon, we are actively building connectors and supporting securing workloads in those environments. And we don't care, like, you know, I think a lot of people think that Microsoft only does Microsoft. And we're on all the endpoints. I don't think I mentioned that. We're on Mac, we're on iOS, we're on Android, we're on Linux, Linux desktop, not just Linux server, and obviously Windows. But for infrastructure, we're going across all those cloud environments and securing workloads, not just in our space. One of the biggest things is that I would stress here is microsegmentation. So if we think about the firewall sort of idea around our organization, we want to do away with that and essentially think of each endpoint, each node, each individual as kind of their own, each piece of data as their own moat, as their own firewall around them. That you have to authenticate in those places as well. So using tools to microsegment your infrastructure so that you have just-in-time access and just enough access. You don't have to have administrator accounts anymore. You can have people who are granted administrator privileges, but have to escalate to get there. Similarly to how things have been done on Linux for a while, in varying degrees with PAM and whatnot. So this is the last one. And essentially, I think all I want to really point out here, and we can move on, is that Azure is going to have the ability to do significant networking. Not everybody knows that. So you have Azure Firewall, you've got routing, you've got a number of tools at your fingertips to facilitate your microsegmentation as well as any of the infrastructure needs that you have. And you can also use Azure AD Proxy to publish on-prem applications. I know this is a big one because our on-prem applications tend to be less protected and people have to VPN into them. And once they're in the front door, they get everything. So just wanted to really harp on that one, but we can move to the next one.
Preview.
Yeah, so this is just a review, rolling up the whole picture, if you will. If we go to the next slide, my one last thing is that there is a significant economic impact to using zero trust solutions from Microsoft. It's been one thing that we've seen time over time with our customers, and Microsoft has received the Gartner Magic Quadrant leader for Microsoft Sentinel for being a leader in the space. And if you go and look that up right now, we're significantly outpacing all the competitors in that top right quadrant with our ability to deliver. Nobody else is coming close. So with that, I will hand it back over to Bill.
All right. So as we dive into the section about how do you go about this from a real world perspective and what do you focus on, I wanted to point out there's been a large discussion in my time in the tribal space with data sovereignty and whether the cloud is a four-letter word. And but what we're seeing is that lots of tribes have realized that there is benefit to the cloud, and there are so many financial advantages to be able to do it as well, simply because you don't have to build out the infrastructure, which costs you money. You can let Microsoft build out the infrastructure and manage the patches and manage, the security. So just wanted to make that slide, and then we're going to dive right into it here. All right, so we divided this into 5 steps, and there's a lot of meat in each one of these steps. So I'm not going to get too terribly deep in any of it, but the first thing you got to do is you got to assess what's your existing security posture. And my first bullet there was getting into an identity-centric mindset. That whole concept that Brent elaborated on about having that ID badge checked every time you touch an asset, as opposed to once you're authenticated and in. It's, as I like to say, Haight-Ashbury. So, and then you want to be able to evaluate your current environment based on zero trust principles. Now, at Microsoft Ignite, just last week or earlier this week, I guess it was, there's a link there, which Michelle's going to put in the chat later on, but this is an assessment that you can take from the 10,000 foot level, and it dives into each of the pillars, and it asks you a bunch of questions. So it helps you assess your readiness. So that's step 1. You got to really have that candid conversation with yourself and with your team and with your leadership, honestly, that says, we need to do this because we're in danger. We're assuming that we're breached. Let's figure out how we're going to go forward. So number 2 and number 3, I struggled with which order, because they really have to happen simultaneously. So building a security operations team or a security operations center, and there's really 2 ways you can go about that. Well, 3 actually. You can do it all in-house, which requires human resources, it requires devices and so on and so forth, or you can hire it out. And there are plenty of vendors out there that are doing it. Microsoft has a partner, Brent, it's Conquest Cyber.
Yeah, Conquest Cyber has been knocking that out of the park lately. So
yeah, who can basically build your security operations center and manage the sovereignty of your information. The reason that you want to do this is your SOC team and your security team is going to be deeply involved in all the decision making for the steps that follow. So I opted to put it in as number 2, but it's not the low-hanging fruit, but it's something you got to get started immediately. And for example, at the Eastern Band, we spent quite a bit of time educating our team on Custo queries, which is the query language that is used within Sentinel to be able to automate alerts and detect things in advance and put some of our own logic rules on top of that. But whatever you do, it's really important that you focus on how you're going to do security operations, how you're going to implement it, how you're going to watch it, and which roles individuals will have. All right, so next up, prioritize the security of identities, devices, and apps. So we've already mentioned going to the Azure Active Directory join. The low-hanging fruit here is MFA. The most bang for the buck that you are going to get in securing your information is going to be switching on MFA and then getting away from traditional Active Directory joins. Once you join, you create an implicit trust within the old on-prem Active Directory. And the fact of the matter is that some legacy applications that were coded still require it. And that's where the concept of micro-segmentation comes in. You're going to have, if you virtualize that legacy app, sometimes you'll have to have accurate a synchronization with a local copy for that app, but that gets walled off into its own segment, and so that it can't be penetrated from the side. Mentioned Endpoint Manager, that was a big deal. Early on was to start getting, we had Apple devices, they have Apple devices, and mainly Microsoft Windows for enterprise devices. So getting those things into endpoint management starts to allow you to enforce what goes to that device, what happens to it when it gets sick, gets some virus or something like that. They took the approach of basically treating treating endpoints like cattle. No data is stored on it. It's all in SharePoint. If it gets a virus, the first response is wipe it, and you can wipe it with your endpoint manager. So that's something that you can do to help secure your endpoints. And again, there's a lot of steps in here, and this whole thing is still ongoing. Here's the heavy lift, and Brent alluded to this earlier, and mentioned some of the tools that you use to establish data governance. But you can think of data governance at a high level as just labeling data and then making rules to see how it moves. The problem is, in the example of the Eastern Band, what might be highly sensitive data to the Cherokee Department of Transportation is probably not highly sensitive data to the Public Health and Human Services Division. So if you've got a complex government organization or a complex enterprise organization, this is, as Brent said, not trivial. You got to work with the stakeholder bodies, you got to get leadership involved. And what you absolutely want to avoid in data governance is the paralysis of analysis, meaning making 72 categories that once you, if a user is going to have to categorize the data, and you can automate some of this by putting folders in certain categories and things like that. But at the end of the day, somebody will have to make a choice on some of the documents that they create. And if they've got 40 choices, the one they're going to pick is the first one. And then your categorization is meaningless in the labeling. Once you have it labeled, then you can use all these tools to begin to, and this is the phase that the Eastern Band is at now, largely. Once you have all that data labeled, you can start to use these tools to, and machine learning and the AIs to go and actually stop the data exfiltration while it's happening. Somebody decides they're going to upload the whole communications photo library to Google Drive, and you don't want that to happen. You can actually witness that happening and stop it without having to have somebody staring at a pane of glass to do it. And then we talked a little bit, I'll just mention this at the bottom here. We talked about there's a difference between what is included in Microsoft 365 E3 and E5. Pretty much all the tools that we're talking about, if you have an E5 license, are included. Some of these things can be bought as add-ons, but it doesn't take too many of the add-ons to add up to pricing for E5. So you get a whole lot of other things that you can, and the big key is automation of those products. In E5, there's a whole lot more automation, and that's where you want to be, because it's going to drive your SOC staff down, and it allows the machine learning to do the work for you. And then the last step is continual optimization. So during the time that I was with the Eastern Band, for example, we had products that, one of the things that happens in the Azure stack is there's constant evolution. There's constant evolution of the products, what the product's capabilities are, and what was available in December of 2019 is far less than what's available now in terms of feature sets. So you're not going to be able to make, my point about this continuously optimizing is you're not going to be able to make a lot of initial choices that have the granularity that you need. So you're going to throw something at the problem, whichever one you happen to be trying to solve, and then you're going to refine and refine and refine and bring other tools to bear. So anyway, that's the way our whole goal here is to be proactive and not reactive. I have worked in the information technology industry for 37 years, and reactivity was the way it was done, and this really changes the game. I mean, I can speak from experience on this. It's fantastic to be able to have these tool sets, and that's pretty much what I had to say about the steps, and we'll take questions on those. So just to talk a little bit more about what happened, there's going to be a link there. Microsoft just published a case study on the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian that you can view. They released it at TribalNet, and that link will be in the chat, and that's the actual banner for the video, of course, there. But I just wanted to talk about the five, there's 5 sort of generic steps that I outlined evolve from the way it happened with the tribe. And I'm not going to dwell too long because we still have to have time for questions. when we were ransomed, they were a completely on-premise operation. And we basically were wiped out. The only thing that stayed up was the Exchange server because it had already been moved into Microsoft 365. So it was a really catastrophic event. It affected 137 virtual machines, all of our endpoints. All of our Microsoft endpoints. It was an unmitigated disaster of the first order. So we started from the ground up. And so the assess our security architecture was really a snap decision that we had to make. We already were E5 licensed. So we got support from the Microsoft Tribal team and just took the decision, we're going all in. And so we were able to then focus on endpoints, getting the devices secure, getting them locked down, focused on doing just-in-time elevation, which is another concept that's fantastic. With privileged identity management in M365/Azure, you are able to eliminate zero persistent admin. Everybody has a SQL server out there that's got the root or the global admin account in it as the authority. That concept goes away when you move to zero trust architecture. It's all done just in time, and the Eastern Band actually implemented what's called a privileged access workstation notion. So not only do you have to ask permission and be approved to get elevated to a specific set of roles, you also have to have a specific device to be able to ask for that elevation. So it's like a double whammy as far as locking down who can possibly get administrative privilege. So I just wanted to make sure that we covered that. At any rate, we started working through those different pillars, some of them simultaneously. And the one thing that I think is really important is that we had a great partner. And so I'm going to jump over to the getting started because I want to leave ample time here for questions. Partnering with a trusted advisor. At the case with the EBCI, the partner we actually hired a Microsoft designated support engineer as a part of our premier contract, our premier support contract. And that engineer was embedded with us for nearly 2 years and helped us leverage all of the tools. There's even some features that are in the Azure stack that the Eastern Band had requested that eventually went to the product teams and was implemented. So the big point here is it's a big investment. It's a big investment, but it's worth your time. And by making the investment, you're going to drive down your costs. You're going to make your individual team members more productive because they're not going to be focusing on patching the Windows Server 2008 R2 primary domain controller. So you're really switching a lot of that workload. Microsoft spends $3 billion a year on security, and they have a massive SOC, and a lot of this stuff, automation never gets, the bad things just don't get through to you once you implement this architecture. So, and again, don't wait till you get breached. And we put the link there again for the security zero trust posture survey or questionnaire. So please, by all means, use that tool. And I think that pretty much wraps me up. So I'm going to switch it over to Michelle again. I'm going to take down my share here. And I'm sure there must be, I wasn't watching the chat, so hopefully there's some questions out there.
Yes, I do have a couple questions to start with. The first one is asking, what are the infrastructure requirements for zero trust?
Well, I can speak for the example that I know. The infrastructure requirements are basically committing to going into a cloud migrated environment. This is a complicated answer, so forgive me for stumbling a little bit on it. One of the things that happens in a normal environment, like you're not ransomed and you're not completely out of business. You've got production needs that you're going to have to keep alive. Some of that stuff is on-prem. There was actually a talk at this year's TribalNet about migrating enterprise apps to Azure Cloud. or to the cloud. So you're going to need to you're going to need to evaluate what licensing you need. And it's important to understand that M365 implements most of the features that you need. So when you get an E3 or E5 license, E3 with add-ons or a full E5 license, a lot of what we talked about today is already included. And that comes with a cost, of course. It's, I think we were paying $500+ per user per year or something along those lines. But it's well worth the investment because we were already paying it. And we were able to implement all this other security without any additional licensing costs. So they no longer have any power consumption requirements. They have no longer any hardware refresh requirements. They have no need to patch operating systems and things of that nature. It's all managed. So when you start to look at the numbers about what you would be spending versus what you are by going with E3, E5, it really starts to make total sense. And that slide that Brent showed with the return on investment speaks to that. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yes. Yeah, if you want more information, just resubmit a question and we can dig into that. Looks like there was something that was just sent in the chat. Brent, did you see that? It says
yeah, I can absolutely answer this question. From Philip.
Okay. Yes.
Yep. Okay. Awesome. So this is a great question, Philip. So for anybody who can't see it, I have heard the term just-in-time elevation, but have not heard anyone explain the practical use or implementation. Does this mean a security person changes your account access for you when you need that elevation, or is it somehow automated, or does it just mean using a different account that has elevation assigned for the given task? So there are multiple answers to this, and it kind of depends on how you want to run your enterprise. You can have, and you don't have to make just one decision. So you can have certain administrators who are going to have more or less automated access. So when they apply for escalation, they'll just get it and then it gets logged. You can also have it so that people who are less trusted, as it were, have to have a second party approve their escalation, or perhaps it's not even that they're less trusted, it's that it's a more critical asset that no one person should have the ability to escalate by themselves to get that access. So there are a couple ways that you can set it up, and it's not universal. It's not going to apply to everybody. It's going to apply to specific groups of people. So you can, I guess the short answer is you can use your creativity and make it work for you.
I can speak a little bit to how it was implemented for the Eastern Band. So we basically tried to eliminate anybody ever having to use the global admin account. And there's a feature called Azure PIM, Privileged Identity Management, which allows you to set up the rules that Brent was just discussing. And so the way we did it was, if I'm in the telecommunications group, I have one set of privileges that I may need to manage. If I'm in the endpoint management group or service desk, I may have a set of privileges. So we went through each of the privileges, and rather than handing out global admin to everybody, we created what we called super groups. So sysadmins for infrastructure had a whole larger set of privileges. And then what we implemented was a verification step. So in other words, the one thing about just-in-time elevation is you are limited in the amount of time that elevation lasts. So the default, I think, is 9 hours, but you request elevation and somebody else on your team or your manager or the director has to authorize you to get that access. And once it's authorized, you're elevated. And then we had a standing rule that you needed to turn that down. If you're leaving at the end of the day, don't ask for 9 hours worth of privilege elevation. But there was very few things that needed to have global admin, very few. And typically it was dealing with your enterprise subscriptions and really high level stuff. So.
Yeah, even just the granular permissions available allows you to kind of take care of a lot of those issues.
All right, so let's see. Moving on. Next question is asking, if you hire out a SOC service, is it still recommended to use an SIEM like Sentinel?
Short answer is they will probably be providing that for you or managing it. It depends on the provider. And Brent, you may want to chime in here.
I would shop for somebody that at least for like if I was in your shoes, I would shop for somebody that gives you access, and that you're able to see all of that coming across. I know with Conquest Cyber, not only do they give you access, but they actually simplify. They have their own software that or their own overlay that is a GUI in front of Sentinel and Azure in general that kind of boils everything up in a way that's much easier to deal with without any training. So you might find some varied results depending on who you're talking to as a SOC as a service.
In the EBCI team's example, we tried to use everything pure Microsoft as we were rebuilding this all out because we were starting from the ground, from ground zero. One of the things about using third-party apps and things like that is you introduce another vector for attack from the supply chain and so on and so forth. So we try to stay to the extent possible within the entire Microsoft stack. Thus, we chose Sentinel as the product. Depending on which SOC vendor you might choose to partner with, they may have something that they recommend or some, like as Brent said, some overlays.
I would feel very squeamish though if I didn't have like the ability to look at any of that.
Right.
That would make me feel uncomfortable.
Okay, next question. Is there a case for keeping some servers on site? I'm wondering about server-based applications that deal with large files running off the cloud and bandwidth/data consumption cost. How are these secured?
So I can speak directly to this because the company that I was at was actually a DoD contractor that processed like very large terabyte files and computation algorithms on site. We could not do it in the cloud. It was a thing that we like constantly tried to figure out how to push to the cloud, and there was no way to do it. So essentially, we ended up building a hybrid model. We pulled in Azure Arc and a couple other tools to get cloud visibility on our on-prem assets, as well as using all the normal tools in the book that we've all grown up using within IT to secure those assets on-prem. So like your firewalls, your various layers, but focusing on identity and making sure that the identity piece is there, that you have MFA in front of your compute machines. If it's a large file thing, a lot of those, in my experience, have tended to be on Linux or something like that, Linux servers, and getting that identity piece in place, MFA in place, is really critical. And there are several different ways that I've seen people handle that, whether that's through using an Azure jump box or Azure Arc. There are a bunch of different ways to moderate that access.
And the truth of the matter is that there's going to be certain services like DHCP, for example. It's really hard to do. You can't do that from the cloud. You got to have a local DHCP server. It could be one of your firewalls like your Palo Altos, or it could be a copy of Server 2019 Enterprise running a couple of virtuals just to handle things that are actually local, like wireless access controllers and things of that nature. But you want to eliminate them to the extent you can. But the other nice thing about it is they can actually be Azure AD joined, and you can also install the Defender tools on the server, and it'll interplay with your Sentinel.
Right. And we plug into Palo Alto as well. So that's another thing to note. Your on-prem hardware is able to plug into Sentinel, and all your feeds can go to one place. And that's what we did for our shop, because we had, it's a small shop. We had PA 220s that were running the good majority of our perimeter of our network. And I think not alone with, a lot of other smaller shops like that. So.
All right, so this next one is for you, Bill. it asks, Bill, why did you decide to talk through your experience that happened at Eastern Band?
It informs the way that I think about things, because I was there during it was an interesting time, highly challenging, put a lot of hours in, and it also informs my understanding of the Azure and Microsoft 365 architecture. So it's almost wired into my DNA, and I can't talk about the product and how you can use it without relying on that experience. So I'd say that's the short answer.
Great. So that's all the questions I have, unless anybody wants to type anything real quick in the chat here. But I will, when I send out the recording to everybody, I will also link to those 2 documents that we put in the chat. Oh, we have something here. So the tribe went all Azure, AD, and on-prem.
On-prem is Azure Join.
Azure Join, yep.
Yeah. Yes, that's correct. So, and minimizing the number of things. So in actuality, there is one system that they're working on. So to add a little bit of color commentary here, we set up, as part of this entire process at the Eastern Band, we set up a secure admin services team, and then a very detailed process for how we interrogate software as a service offerings. And as a result, they pushed most of the new applications that they get into cloud-based apps, and then leveraging single sign-on, where the Azure Active Directory is actually the single source of identity provision, and then that's passed over using SAML to these outside apps. But by doing that, you can start to eliminate things like surveillance and security can be put into the cloud, because you've got cameras now that store the information right on the camera, so you don't have that bandwidth issue and then it just gets backed up overnight. There's all sorts of things that you can leverage, but the 911 call center is still on-prem, and that was simply because it had to be back up like ASAP. So, and I know that they were evaluating other possibilities to look at SaaS-based services, but that's, as I said, it's a journey.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thank you guys. And like I was saying, I will send links in the email that everybody gets with the 2 links that I shared in the chat today, just in case anybody missed it. And if you need to reach out to Bill or to Brent, you can always reach out to our team here at Tribal Hub, and we will definitely put you in touch. And with that, I wish everybody a great afternoon. And again, thank you, Bill and Brent, for coming on and sharing all your knowledge. It was a great, very informative afternoon for sure.
Thanks everybody for being here.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, we'll see you guys later.
We'll see you.
Bye.
Bye.